Hi, this is History MD coming to you with the latest historical emergency, pandemics, pestilence, and plagues. So let's get right to it, shall we? In this video, we're going to be talking about the three essential P's in the history of disease: pandemics, pestilence, and plagues. First off, let's start with etymology and review the history and meaning of these words. What is a pandemic? The word first appeared as an adjective in the English language in 1666, designating an occurrence over a wide geographic area and affecting an exceptionally high proportion of the population. It has also been used as a noun since the second half of the 19th century to refer to an outbreak of a disease that occurs over a wide geographic area and affects an exceptionally high proportion of the population. So both as an adjective and a noun, the word entails a wide geographic distribution, as well as an exceptionally high propagation amongst the population. The word's history can be traced back to the late Latin pandemos, itself a derived form of the Greek pandemos, meaning of all the people. Therefore, we can refer to pandemics as exceptionally contagious diseases that threaten all people across a wide geography. But these are by no means a novelty of modernity. Before the 17th century, one would more readily have used the words pestilence or plague. So, what is pestilence? Pestilence probably entered the English language in the 14th century as a noun referring to a contagious or infectious epidemic disease that is virulent and devastating, especially in relation to the bubonic plague. The word's history can be traced back to the Latin pestis, which would have entered English through the Middle French word of peste, which in turn designates a plague. What then is a plague? Plague appears to have entered the English language around the same time as its synonym counterpart, pestilence, describing a disastrous evil or affliction, like another one of its synonyms, calamity. The word is likewise the proper name of the disease that caused the Black Death in medieval Europe. Also used as a verb from the 15th century onwards, plague can be used to describe the action of afflicting with the disease or to cause distress or a disturbance. The word's history can be traced back to the Middle English plage that had derived from the late Latin plaga, akin to the verb plangere, meaning to strike. It is worth noting that none of the three words existed in the English language before the occurrence of the Black Death in England, and that all three of them denote a definite negativity. Call it plague, pestilence, or pandemic if you will, they all incite a primal fear, the fear of death. The reason why we start our history with the quintessential answer to the fear of death: organized religion. Monotheistic religions of the Middle East offer an invaluable source to the historian of disease, a written record of their past in the form of holy scriptures. The Old Testament might not be considered an objective source for studying history. However, it is nonetheless interesting to review the instances of pestilence in the Hebrew Bible as records of historical trauma created by disease. In the ancient Middle East, there were no doctors or hospitals, as most diseases were treated at home, as illustrated in the story of the prophet Elisha's healing of a child. Although we do encounter healers in the biblical texts, they tend to be criticized as worthless before the single true healer, God. People at this time had no notion of germs, and even their understanding of the basic functioning of the human body was preposterous, believing that emotions were felt in the liver and that thoughts were formed in the heart. Ancient medicine often had a magical quality, as most people would consult priests and exorcists in order to counter the actions of an unsatisfied god or an evil demon. Belief was the medicine of the ill, along the same lines as the modern placebo effect. However, we do observe some medical treatments in the Bible, such as in the story of the prophet Isaiah, who healed King Hezekiah by pressing figs on his sores, as well as the miracle cures of the prophets Elijah and Elisha, even though in each of these instances, God and not man was credited with the positive outcome. Both Moses and Miriam suffered from a disease called tsarat in Hebrew, which has often been translated into English as leprosy. According to the rabbis, however, tsarat is caused by sin, hence being a spiritual pathology. We know from the book of Leviticus that part of the treatment of tsarat was social isolation, which points to the fact that it was a contagious disease. Maimonides viewed tsarat as a withdrawal of godliness from the world, while Maimonides, who was a physician himself, recognized that tsarat was probably referring to a few different skin diseases that were particularly destructive. However, the most famous record of pestilence in the Hebrew Bible can be found in the book of Exodus, the Makot Mitzrayim, or the plagues of Egypt. Historical debates concerning the exactitude and details of these events put aside, the story that has found its Hollywood expression in the 1956 classic starring Charlton Heston depicts 10 plagues. First, the water turned to blood. Secondly, an army of frogs appeared. Then came the lice and the flies. The fifth plague was a pestilence affecting livestock, followed by festering boils affecting men. Later came the thunderstorm of hail and fire, the locusts and darkness for 3 consecutive days, and finally the death of the firstborn. These plagues were a punishment by God upon the unbelievers, and the 6th plague can be truly characterized as a pestilence. However, the historicity of the plagues described in the Hebrew Bible are up for debate. Therefore, when we speak of pandemics and plagues in history, we tend to start with the one that affected Athens in the 5th century BCE. This was an epidemic that devastated the city during the 2nd year of the Peloponnesian War, just as an Athenian victory seemed to be imminent. Although the disease that caused the plague remains a subject for discussion, it is safe to assume that this was probably a typhoid outbreak of African origins. The disease decimated the population, killing up to 100,000 people, and depleted the military, even killing the legendary leader Pericles. Athens had no other choice than to sue for peace. In time, Athens was defeated, and its government overthrown by Sparta. Thucydides wrote the following lines in his History of the Peloponnesian War, quote, "The catastrophe was so overwhelming that men, not knowing what would happen next to them, became indifferent to every rule of religion or law," unquote. The plague was an event without prior in recorded history, and Athens never recovered from the resulting crisis. Romans who conquered Greece just a few centuries later probably never expected their empire to fall from grace, but Rome, too, met its demise, and pestilence was once more a critical actor. Plague ravaged Rome in the 2nd century of our era. It has come to be called either the Plague of Galen, after the Greek physician who described it, or the Antonine Plague after the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, who himself probably died of the disease. The pestilence was brought to the imperial center by troops returning from the eastern campaigns. Once again, the true nature of the disease remains obscure, but the descriptions carry similarities with smallpox and measles. Roman historian Dio Cassius wrote that there were up to 2,000 deaths per day, the disease killing a quarter of those who were affected. Total deaths in the empire are estimated at around 5 million, which means a quarter of the overall population. But casualties over Eurasia might have been much greater, as some scholars have proposed that the plague might have originated in eastern Han China before its appearance in the West in 166. The plague greatly affected the Roman culture, and it also led to the spread of Christianity. Furthermore, it may have played a decisive role in the decreasing importance of transcontinental trade in Eurasia. The plague returned to the empire during the crisis of the 3rd century, this time severely weakening the Roman army. It is known as the Plague of Cyprian, after the memory of Saint Cyprian, an early Christian cleric who described the pestilence. Yet again, the exact disease that caused the plague is up for discussion, but the probable suspects seem to be either smallpox, influenza, or even something like the Ebola virus. This time around, the plagues dealt a strike from which the Roman Empire could not recuperate. The destruction of the empire's structural integrity was accompanied with the explosive growth of Christianity in the Roman world. And the plague returned to the Roman Empire once again during the 6th century, that is, the Eastern Roman Empire. It occurred during the reign of Emperor Justinian, who himself is reported to have survived the disease. The epicenter of the pandemic is thought to be in Central Asia, while we owe our historical record of this episode of the plague to the Byzantine historian Procopius. According to him, the disease reached Constantinople through rats carried in by trade ships arriving from Egypt. Procopius wrote that the whole city smelled like death because there was no room to bury the dead, as corpses were left out in the open. Some historians propose that the plague of Justinian was one of the deadliest pandemics in history, placing the total number of deaths as high as 100 million people worldwide, while others argue that its effects have been greatly exaggerated by posterity. But one thing remains clear: the plague dealt a huge blow to Justinian's dream of a unified Roman Empire, because pestilence resulted in decreased tax revenues due to the massive disruption in agriculture and trade. Back in 2013, it was scientifically proven that the causative disease of the plague of Justinian was indeed the plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis that would return to Europe several centuries later. After 750, major epidemic diseases disappeared in Europe until the Black Death. The Black Death was a pandemic of bubonic plague and its variant, pneumonic plague, that affected Eurasia in the mid-14th century. The name black probably derives from a misunderstanding of atra in Latin, which can either mean black or terrible. The plague is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis that is spread by rat fleas. The place where they bite swells up to form a painful bubo, hence the name bubonic. It takes people up to 5 days to get sick, and in another 5 days, 80% of the people die of the infection. However, the plague bacteria can also break out of the buboes and travel to the lungs through the bloodstream and cause a variant of the plague spread by contaminated droplets from coughs. This is the pneumonic plague. Because the plague is transmitted by rat fleas, the disease is limited to the warmer seasons, disappearing during the winter. An insect-borne disease, the plague uses the rats as a means of transport, hence affecting the rural areas more so than urban centers. Scientific research conducted in medieval European cemeteries suggests that it began in 1346 in the steppes of Central Asia before spreading to southern Russia, where the bacterium survives to this day. There is general consensus that the epidemic began in Kaffa, Theodisia, in Crimea in the autumn of 1346. Italian merchants then took it from there to Europe. The subcontinent had a population explosion in the High Middle Ages, which destroyed much of Europe's forests in favor of more human settlements, which operated a busy trading network that allowed contagious diseases to reach even the most isolated hamlets. The plague spread fast over great distances due to the increased trade connectivity on the subcontinent, particularly via ships. Italian merchants arrived in the Eastern Roman capital in May 1347, where the plague epidemic started in July. The Black Death then took to other Mediterranean ports in the autumn of 1347. Great commercial cities such as Marseille, Genoa, Venice, and Pisa functioned as bridgeheads, from where the disease conquered Europe. The great poet of the Renaissance, Petrarch, who lost his beloved Laura to the disease, wrote that the future generations would not believe what was happening. Corpses were piling up in great pits, turning into mass graves. In just a few months, more than half of the population of Florence perished due to the plague. As Iceland and Finland were the only regions that avoided the Black Death, due to their small populations with little contact with the rest of Europe. The Black Death could have killed up to 200 million people worldwide, up to 50 million in Europe, which is about 60% of its population at the time. Following the pandemic, there was a shortage of manpower, which led to a rise in wages and an overall improvement of people's diets. Landlords struggled to come to terms with the changes in the land market as a result of the loss in population. There was large-scale migration after the Black Death, as people took advantage of opportunities to move to better land or pursue trade in more prosperous towns. A new middle class emerged, who were people not born into the landed gentry, but were able to make enough surplus wealth to purchase plots of land, as property ownership opened up to market speculation. Some even see the Black Death as a pestilence that undermined the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, paving the way for the Protestant Reformation just a few centuries later. Faith and plague have had a complex relationship over the centuries. In 1527, when the bubonic plague hit Wittenberg, Martin Luther refused calls to flee the city and protect himself. Rather, he stayed and ministered to the sick at the cost of the life of his daughter Elizabeth. In fact, he produced a tract on the subject entitled Whether Christians Should Flee the Plague. This episode took place as a part of a series of plague epidemics which started off with the Black Death and periodically reoccurred in Europe until the 19th century. By the year 1400, it might have killed off an estimated 450 million of the world's total population. The plague of 1576, for instance, is reported to have killed 50,000 in Venice alone. In the Middle Ages, Venice was a superpower and probably the wealthiest city on the planet at one time, as well as the leading naval and commercial power of its region. It was heavily affected by the plague and never could recover, so the geopolitical center of Europe shifted to the countries of the North Sea. Strategies to cope with the plague in pre-industrial Europe have formed the basis for later policies and are mirrored in current public health initiatives. Policies of containment, mitigation, and quarantine are nothing new. Cordons sanitaires, staffed by soldiers along frontiers to prevent the introduction of plague into states, impacted negatively on the economy, as embargoes were introduced on industries, trade, and commerce. There were a series of great plague outbreaks during the 17th century in important urban centers such as Seville, London, and Vienna. These were followed in the 18th century by the Great Plague of Marseille, the Great Plague of Eastern Europe, and the Russian Plague, while the plague lingered on in the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East until the second quarter of the 19th century. As the plague seemed to disappear, the most important contagious disease became a new one. 7 cholera pandemics have occurred in the last 200 years. The first cholera pandemic originated in India in 1817. The first 6 cholera pandemics that occurred until 1923 took place consecutively and continuously over time. Deaths in India from the 3 cholera pandemics that occurred between 1817 and 1860 might have cost the lives of up to 15 million people, another 23 million perishing during the next 3 pandemics. Increased travel around the world is credited for the transmission of cholera. However, major scientific breakthroughs, such as the first immunization by Pasteur, the development of a vaccine, and the identification of the bacterium Vibrio cholerae in the last quarter of the 19th century pushed back the disease. It was only after a long hiatus that the 7th cholera pandemic occurred in 1961. Although on a much smaller scale, outbreaks continue to affect the developing world, where epidemics tend to occur after civil unrest, wars, or natural disasters, when water supplies become contaminated. The plague made a comeback in the 19th century. It began in Yunnan, China, in 1855, and spread to all inhabited continents, and is considered to have been active until 1960. It originated there following a considerable influx of migrants in relation to the exploitation of mines. The third plague pandemic killed up to 10 million people in British India alone. When it struck the city of Canton in 1894, the disease killed 60,000 people in a few weeks. And the disease became endemic in Hong Kong until 1929. But another deadly disease was waiting to replace the fear of the plague. Influenza is an ancient disease that might have originated in China. It was described by Hippocrates almost 2,500 years ago. However, the first historical record of an influenza pandemic was chronicled in 1510. In total, 10 influenza pandemics were recorded before the Spanish flu of 1918, with the pandemic of 1830 to 1833 being particularly widespread. The 1889 to 1890 flu pandemic was known as the Asiatic or the Russian flu, killing about 1 million people worldwide. It is considered to be the last great pandemic of the 19th century. Meanwhile, 3 influenza pandemics have occurred during the 20th century. The first being the Great Influenza of 1918. For the longest time, it was estimated that 20 million died worldwide. However, recent research estimates that the real death toll could be as high as 100 million. If the coronavirus kills 2% of the infected, then we would have a similar death toll as in 1918. 100 million people who perished from the pandemic in 1918 would be the equivalent today of 430 million people. John Barry, the author of The Great Influenza, writes, "People were already avoiding each other, turning their heads away if they had to talk, isolating themselves." The Spanish flu pandemic was perhaps the greatest disaster to ever befall humanity, while it's been strangely overlooked. The single most important lesson from the 1918 influenza, according to John Barry, was containment. Non-pharmaceutical interventions such as social distancing, washing hands, coughing into elbows, staying home when sick were meant to flatten the curve. In 1918, many cities imposed restrictions but lifted them too soon, only to reimpose them. About 40 years later, the flu struck again with the Asian flu of 1957 that originated in Guizhou province and killed at least 1 million people around the world. 10 years later, the Hong Kong flu of 1968 again decimated the world, population causing an estimated 1 million deaths worldwide. The last flu pandemic in recent memory was the swine flu or H1N1 outbreak that took place in 2009. However, out of all these diseases, smallpox remains the only human disease to have been officially eradicated back in 1980. But as the 21st century draws closer to the end of its first quarter, we have had other diseases to worry about. In 2002, a previously unknown type of pneumonia appeared in China. The severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, a coronavirus like COVID-19, killed over 700 people in North and South America, Europe and Asia. Another was Ebola, which was first identified in 1976, but was confined to the small outbreaks in Central Asia. Then suddenly, in 2014, it struck in West Africa and then across the world. And of course, by 2016, the HIV and AIDS pandemic, which had come to worldwide notice in the 1980s, had been responsible for at least 35 million deaths. For anything on a comparable scale, aside from the Spanish flu, we have to go back to the 14th century and the Black Death. So, this is the story of pandemics so far. But what can we say about their social effects? Suspicion, blame, and violence towards the poor and the other increase in times of pestilence. This is because of the fact that epidemics strike from the outside and are carried by foreign hosts that are thought to stem from poverty and pollution. The poor have been often perceived as incubators of disease. For instance, during the bubonic plague outbreak in India in the 19th century, the poor were gathered together in subhuman segregation camps that resulted in riots against the colonial regime. Similarly, There were cholera riots in the 1830s that continued well into the 20th century. In these riots, the poor were the perpetrators of violence, often directed against health workers who were accused of inventing the disease to cull populations of the poor. But epidemics could also end class strife, as between senatorial elites and plebes in 5th century Rome, or factional murder between the Blues and the Greens in Constantinople with the Justinian plague. Pandemics can also manifest the better side of humanity in the form of mass volunteerism, as in the Great Influenza outbreak of 1918. Epidemics breed fear and suspicion that multiply more rapidly than any virus. When a mysterious illness erupts, the first unhelpful reaction is to panic. The second is to identify a culprit. In his semi-novel, Journal of a Plague Year, Daniel Defoe described the mounting chaos as enforced isolation proved counterproductive. Prisoners broke down, locked doors, and looted deserted properties. Those who could afford the luxury of rural seclusion, the plague provided a productive sabbatical. Just as the microscopist Robert Hooke was speculating on the meaning of some fossils that he had found, Isaac Newton, then a Cambridge undergraduate, allegedly sat under an apple tree to conceive the theory of gravity. But how does the COVID-19 pandemic compare so far? Although the plague and the coronavirus are very different, there are some lessons that can be taken from a comparison between the two. First of all, it must be stressed that past pandemics were far more deadly than the coronavirus, which has a relatively low death rate. If we take what happened following the Black Death as a point of reference, we can say that maintaining the status quo for vested interests can spark unrest and political volatility. Restricting freedom of movement can cause a violent reaction. For example, the Black Death saw an increase in xenophobia and anti-Semitism. Another frequent historical comparison is with the Great Flu pandemic of 1918. Coronavirus is medically speaking very different from the Great Flu pandemic, although the fear is similar. A majority of those killed were in the prime of their lives, their 20s, 30s, and 40s. Indeed, the use of surgical masks, stockpiling food, and avoidance of public gatherings do resonate with it, but the medical reality is different. Alfred Crosby wrote in America's Forgotten Pandemic that nurses often walked into scenes resembling those of the plague in the 14th century. However, in 1918, we were at a very different place. We knew about viruses, but we had to wait until the invention of the electron microscope in 1931 to actually see them. Nowadays, we know how to isolate a virus and find its genetic sequence, test antiviral drugs, and develop a vaccine. In 1918, it was also impossible to test people with mild symptoms so that they could self-quarantine. The 1918 flu had a fatality rate of 2.5, far more deadly than the common flu. The most common feature between the two is the tenor of public concern, as governments that adapt emergency measures will be reluctant to relinquish these new powers. The previous plagues did not end great power rivalry, nor usher in a new era of global cooperation. However, pandemics have the potential to fast forward the rise and fall of great powers, and history will be written by the victors of the COVID-19 crisis, as the West might be elapsed by the East, who is better responding to the current crisis, perhaps showing the benefits of authoritarian rule. Well, if you liked the video, be sure to leave a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. If you have an historical emergency, state them in the comments below. And also a special shout out to my 3 Patreons, Baxter Bear, Osman, and Asuman Yener. Your contributions have given me the motivation to continue on doing these videos. And as always, thanks for watching.